What I'm going to talk about a little bit today really I guess, a little bit of a personal journey in some ways. So my experience of the clinical modelling, and it might be a little bit rambling, but I hope it gives a bit of an overview of where I come from and how we've got to this point, and perhaps a little bit of a view of the future and some of the lessons learned. So I hope that's useful. The title of the talk, if English is not your first language, please don't be stressed by this. Uncomplexication is not an English word. But I came across it on Monday, and I did most of this work for this presentation on Monday afternoon. And I was going to visit some of our Brazilian colleagues who happened to be in Melbourne and coming to visit and talk to us. And I came across this yellow van down by the riverside, and there was a queue of people outside it waiting for free coffees, and on the side of this van was hashtag uncomplexicate. So it was clearly some advertising ploy of some kind, and I must admit it worked, because I looked it up and it was about a health insurance company that was trying to take away the complexity of choosing health insurance. But I quite like the name and it worked quite well, so it really fits with what we're trying to do here, is to try and simplify and streamline some of this notion of the clinical modelling. And the Brazilian colleagues were talking a lot about their national plan and about their infrastructure and infostructure. And it's not usually a word that I use, but rather than saying this is the clinical modelling journey or something really boring, I kind of came up with this name. So I hope it gives you some concept, but a little bit of fun. It's not meant to mean anything in particular. So Lewis, if you're going to be pressing the next button for me, I think now's the time for the first one. So this is something I found in about April last year. It was published by Forbes, and you know, it was as all of this kind of big stuff around big data was reaching its hype and so on. And I really particularly like that second statement there. It's the little data in healthcare that gives us all peptic ulcers. And it's something that we've been trying to deal with building archetypes now for nearly 10 years of my life, but it's really only in the last couple of years that we're finding that people are starting to get it, and we're moving from a period of evangelization about how we need to get the little data right and use clinical information models to do so, into this phase where people are actually starting to use it for real. But there are certainly big pockets where people still don't get that, and people are only just realizing that it's causing a big pain. Lewis, a couple of next clicks for me. So the next couple of statements, I mean, in red are the kind of words that I wanted to highlight, but clinical data is naturally at unit level fairly chaotic and dysfunctional at the moment, and this obvious legacy issue where we have a lot of software vendors who are very proprietary about their databases, and this is the tradition that we've come from, whereas with the notion of archetypes and what we're trying to do with that is actually changing that paradigm enormously. And we're actually seeing that come to fruition, especially within the open air community. So that's quite exciting, and I think we're well ahead of the curve from that point of view. So next again, please. So this is a little bit, I guess, about my journey. The first time I sat down and saw an actual archetype was in 2004 when Sam Hurd came to my house and sat down at my kitchen table, and he showed me the ubiquitous blood pressure archetype as it was. So yes, he used blood pressure on me as well, and we continue to torture people around the world as we do our training, beginning with that blood pressure archetype I think that everybody knows. And he hadn't really explained a lot about the context. He showed me this thing in the archetype editor as it was at that point in time, but it made some clinical sense, and I found it quite intriguing, and that was really the kickstart for my journey to be involved within Ocean and the foundation. The first major venture into building some serious archetypes wasn't until 2007. So in the meantime, we had the archetype editor, and we had recognised the need for templates, and we had a very early version of the template designer at that point in time. It was really my first major foray out in public around building archetypes, and Sam and I and Thomas presented to the NHS in London. We did a training course, and then we kick-started a project. And the scope of the project was to develop archetypes and templates that would represent the top 10 presentations to emergency. So it was things like back pain, chest pain, collapse, those kinds of things. and the range of activities that are needed from the first diagnosis of pregnancy through to postnatal care. And I'm not quite sure where those requirements came from and who picked those topics, but that was what we were given. And so Sam and I sat down and we were basically nomadic and sharing people's houses, and we would sit together during the day across a kitchen table, and we built archetypes. And we just collaborated together, and we were face to face, and we were able to talk around things and build patterns. But really, we hadn't had a lot of experience of building them to any particular patterns. It was something that evolved really from what was common sense and a clinical informatics point of view. Pretty ad hoc, really, when you look back on it. But during 3 weeks, 2 people, we built 210 archetypes and 49 templates. And looking back on that, that was really quite astounding. It was pretty solid work. But the archetypes were just simple. It was really just the data elements. There was no descriptions. There was no metadata. There was none of that kind of stuff to support it. It was just the names of data elements and particular value sets. We were being incredibly pragmatic. There was no other review other than what we discussed with each other and sort of nothing. So it was as simple as bare bones as it could be. But what it did do was demonstrate there was a significant capacity for rapid development, and especially around the archetype reuse across the templates, and just the notion of how to start to collaborate and how did we start to think about patterns for clinical examination and so on, because it's not quite as simple as it might first seem. The other thing that we identified that we didn't have at that point in time was that we needed cluster archetypes, and they did not exist. We only had the entries at that point in time. So that was actually a rapid change in the approach where we started to be able to utilise the clusters to enable nesting of data within the entries, and that was a really big step forward. So next, please, Lewis. And what you're seeing there, and it's quite small on my projected screen, and I think probably for everybody else, I can supply this separately or something similar. But what I've tried to do here is we took all of those archetypes and templates and we did a bit of analysis on it. And across the top on those angled titles are all the names of the different templates. So we've got chest pain and we've got antenatal booking and we've got collapse and so on across there. And down the left-hand side are the names of all the different archetypes. And so what we've done is we've worked out which archetypes were used in which templates. And so right underneath the template names at the top, you can see the first one's got 53, the second one, I can't even read it here. But going across horizontally, you're seeing rather large numbers. So that's saying the total number of archetypes that are used within each template. And going down that left-hand side, the numbers are saying over all of those templates, how many times was that archetype used? So some, in fact, have got zeros, but others have got numbers in the 30s. I think the procedure's got 31 and so on. So it's been the same pattern has been reproduced and reused in different clinical contexts. So it was really the first evidence of that being quite useful. Lewis, can we go to the next one, please? Now, what followed on from that was that there was some ongoing work, and I can't quite remember the sequence of events, but certainly the internal modelers within the NHS proceeded to do some more modelling. And I've had quite a number of people come to me over the years and said, we know that at the end of that phase of modelling, there was a subversion repository that had 600 or 700 archetypes. Whatever happened to them? And so that's the reason why I'm raising it here is because there certainly were. I did a full analysis of what was in that subversion repository at the end of 2007 in December, and published a report that was internal mainly in January, really to kind of cover off our findings, because there were a lot of archetypes that were built, and unfortunately they weren't ones that we've been able to reuse to any great degree. And there was a number of things that came out of it, and one was that really there was not a lot of open air skills. So there'd been a preliminary training, but then they'd kind of been let loose to build archetypes at whim, without a lot of coordination between the team that was building them. What we found was that they were technical modelers. They'd previously been modelling HL7, so they were very good at that, and they approached it from a similar way, which really wasn't something that worked very well from the archetype point of view. They had very little access to any clinical or other domain experts, so they were actually operating very much from this technical domain and Excel spreadsheets that had some of their requirements. They really didn't have any common methodology or coordination of their activities, so they weren't necessarily sitting in the same room or the same area together either, but it certainly identified very much a need for some kind of collaborative or governance tool. So it was a very useful exercise and useful during that, and it's not trying to bash anyone at the NHS or say there were any problems. It really was just a natural evolution of, as humans tried to do this kind of thing, some of the problems and issues came to the forefront fairly quickly, and it's informed us to how to try and approach it slightly differently. So it was very useful. Lewis, next please. So these were some of the things that came out of that analysis. There were things like the wrong class, inconsistent patterns, the granularity. Some archetypes were absolutely massive and really should have been a template and divided up into multiple archetypes. There were some archetypes that had essentially no change, but they'd been created into different versions. So we had multiple iterations with really no content change, so maybe up to version 6 and so on, contributing to some of these numbers. So it kind of gives you a sense of some of the things that we're trying to avoid, I guess, by developing some of the clinical knowledge governance principles that we've got at the moment, and the kind of standards, I guess, of how we're trying to pull together a cohesive pool of archetypes and so on. So it was a very useful exercise very early on. Next, please. So the next natural step was to look at how we might start developing the CKM, and that was deployed from memory. It was quite late in 2008, and what we put into that OpenAIRE CKM and what started it off really were the core archetypes that were built for that across the clinical purposes for the emergency and the antenatal work that Sam and I did, plus a few that we were able to pull out of the NHS internal modelling project. But unfortunately, most of those really weren't fit for purpose, and we still have access to them. We tried to pull out what content we could and pull into other ones that would be suitable for use in CKM, but this is where we started. So that was our initial pool of archetypes that started in the international CKM. Has anyone got any questions about to that point?
No, doesn't look like.
Okay, we'll keep moving. Next, please, Lewis. So this is showing you a map of really where the CKMs are at this point in time. Clearly there is the International OpenAIRE CKM, which has over 1,100 people from 80-something countries last time I looked, which is a fantastic community of people that we've got ready and waiting to participate. It's a fantastic problem to have, and unfortunately we haven't been utilising it to its best performance at the moment, but we intend to change that, and we'll tell you a little bit about that later. What we've got currently at the moment, the next CKM that was deployed was here in Australia in 2009, and that was put in place to help our national program to be able to develop consistent models across all of the different standard documents that were being created for our personally controlled electronic health records. So that was used to underpin those specifications, and more recently the Northern Territory, one of our states, is building particular clinical domain programs around antenatal care and hearing health programs for Indigenous population. The next one was that's currently operating is Ian's been operating one and coordinating one that's shared within the UK. So there's a number of groups that are cooperating within a single instance of CKM. Most recently we've had CKMs implemented obviously in Norway and also in Slovenia, and that triggered my trip across in January, so they're the most recent ones. Sweden did have one that was implemented probably about 2009, 2010, but that's been taken down in recent years due to changes in the way that they've been operating. Moscow City has also had a CKM that's been operating, and I'm not sure that that's actually running at the moment, but they've been utilising that for a particular project. And at the moment we've got a lot of interest from Brazil. The national program there is made a request to be able to have their own national CKM. That's been a long, slow progress because they did actually nominate a number of years ago that OpenAIRE was going to be their main mechanism for clinical content, and a number of states and various other groups have attempted to procure a CKM to start this work, and it hasn't been able to be coordinated very easily, but we think that might be changing. I'll let you know how that goes. And there's currently some proposals that are going into Saudi to actually look at a CKM that might be implemented there, so that will be interesting to see as well. Next, please. Now, this was just really a brain dump on Monday afternoon, as I say, without a lot of research about the groups that are currently doing some modelling. So just off the top of my head, so Australia and New Zealand I know a lot about. Europe, you guys are doing quite a few things there, and there's a number of you there. We've also got Brazil and some other of our South American colleagues. Not a lot happening in the US, which is probably going to be the last place we get a lot of impact, I suspect, because of the HL7 impact. But Southeast Asia is also starting to look, the Asian eHealth Information Network, looking at how they might coordinate some open air activity as well. Now, if you click next, Lewis, you'll see who have I missed.
Yeah.
And as soon as I sent this through to you, I realised I'd missed our hosts. So I'm very remiss and I apologise. But I'm sure you'll find others that I've missed as well that you know as well. But just to try and give a sense that to me this is a big list, and this is showing and demonstrating a lot of activity a few years ago that would have been a lot more Spartan, and we really are seeing a growing momentum around the world of various groups that are collaborating and working together and starting to make some serious impact in this area. So it's exciting from my point of view. Next, please. Now, this is a little bit of honesty. From my point of view, this modelling momentum has been quite disappointing. Up till recently, it's been quite fragmented, piecemeal, they're the words I'm using. Spurts of activity, it's not spurts or activity, there's a typo there. We've had really zero resources that have been allocated centrally, so anything that's happened within the international CKM has been funded or resourced by individuals or companies and so on. And to be honest, I don't think it's unfair if I say it's probably come a lot from the ocean projects and applications that have been built and collaborations and so on to get it kick-started. The reviews and the community that we've got access to there then are fantastic. As I say, it's a fantastic problem to have. I've got so many people I could pull into reviews if we were able to have the resources to actually apply it. But we did a lot of volunteer work, Ian and I, in the early days, and then I got really burnt out. And I think that wasn't a good thing to do, because while we were getting a lot of activity, it was happening in a very small number of people and it wasn't being shared and it wasn't collaborative. So I deliberately stepped back for a while, hoping that there would be shouts of outrage from the community. But unfortunately, we really didn't get that for quite a period of time. So we've had a resource that's been slowly growing, but it's not been sort of optimised in any way. Next, please, Lewis. But this is the good news, because I think it really is changing. So in recent times, I've seen a major change in attitude from within the community, and I've seen all of this modelling activity happening and so on. So I think that the dynamic is changing enormously, and I'm again feeling reinvigorated and really excited. Tomasz Gornik, I think, is with you in the room, and he is leading an industry group who are gathering together some resources to start to fast-track some archetype development, refinement, review and publication. Ian McNichol's participating as well and in leading that, and he's calling it an industry sprint, and I quite like that title. And they can fill you in on more of the details as they're able to, but just to flag that there is this fairly significant activity that's about to be kicked off that I think is actually going to change the whole dynamic and will impact across all of the international CKMs. And I think that's really what we've been looking for ages, and it's about to happen. So from my point of view, that's absolutely brilliant. The coming on board of other CKM instances, so especially locally Norway and Slovenia, the fact that we'll have Brazil, that whole kind of collaborative mindset and all of the opportunities that provides is also incredibly exciting. And it means that we'll get a lot more archetypes that are going to be developed outside of the the previous sort of core groups that have been operating for years, we'll start to get others that are being contributed, and I think it will grow more. This notion of the platform that I think people have been talking about as well means that we're getting much more in the way of applications that are starting to be developed that are going to be consuming the archetypes, and so the demand will continue to grow. So I think we've just reached a point where we'll probably look back and say that was our tipping point, and this is where the dynamics started to change. So from my point of view, this is a great time to be involved. Next, please. So this is where I've started to try and draw together some of the lessons. That's probably not terribly well structured and a bit cohesive, not terribly cohesive, but bear with me, because it just reflects some of my thinking and really my experiences rather than it being terribly well structured. The collaborative model that we've got within OpenAIRE and the whole OpenAIRE community is spectacular. It's a major strength that we have not tapped into as we can, but the whole notion of it underpinning our methodology, our archetype development, and really the collaboration between vendors and that whole notion of sort of open data and interoperability that comes from it is a completely different paradigm to the way electronic health records have been developed previously. So yeah, I find again that that's particularly exciting, and it's a good message to be able to give to others who don't understand quite what we're doing. Also the notion that we are effectively crowdsourcing these models is something that goes against the grain for any other standards development organisation, and they find it quite difficult to understand how we can standardise these things without going through ballots and all that kind of stuff. So all of these kinds of aspects of collaboration are really quite different, but also quite powerful, that I think others are starting to look at and potentially to sort of copy and mimic as well. We're seeing that kind of thing happening with CIMI and so on. They're drawing from some of that experience. Next, please. So again, still focusing a bit on the collaboration, but from the point of view of some of our challenges and some of the excitement comes from, even within a single instance of CKM, that we have multiple subdomains or projects operating within a single group, so a coherent group of archetypes that needs to be collaborated upon. Within the Australian instance, for example, we have the NITA core archetypes in one particular subsection, the subdomain, and then we have ones that have been built for Northern Territory, and it's partly because there's a bit of a political reason for it, but it's going to be interesting to see how that kind of thing evolves, whereas the UK instance has got a number of small groups, none of which who could really afford to have their own CKM in their own right or to operate it or even need a whole CKM, but they're all able to take a little bit of it, and gradually that can potentially become something that's closer to a national CKM potentially into the future. It'll be very interesting to see that kind of organic growth will evolve. Then we're looking at how we actually start to try and get multiple instances cooperating together. We've grappled with the notion of federation of CKMs as we've been designing CKM, and it's hugely complex, and it's defeated us really to this point because it's just the complexity of trying to manage the assets, each of the archetypes, the templates and so on is huge. But we're making baby steps in looking at how we can start to cooperate between them. Not only is there the personal kind of aspect of getting the editors and the administrators of these systems to talk together and that kind of level of cooperation, but also how you can start to share models across the CKMs. And so most recently, some of you will have seen the ability to be able to have a read-only view of selected archetypes from another CKM within your own instance and so on. So we can start to enable that kind of sharing. And then, of course, the challenges of collaborating in an international instance where you're trying to get everybody to share common models, because obviously the more we get sharing and more we actually agree on a common model that's acceptable to everyone, then the more potential for interoperability. So the tension of that, balancing that with what are local requirements is something that's interesting. But this is the constant sort of challenges that we have in any of these decisions we're making around the governance and the archetype development and so on. Next, please. I've spoken a little bit to that, the localisation versus common requirements. So national programs will always have some requirements for administration and various other things, cultural things that are slightly different. So working out what is common requirement across that everyone can accept that's common clinical practice versus what might be required to support local implementation and how we balance that. That's interesting. But also encouraging everybody to be able to play and participate, and that's some of the issues that we've had too. We've had some particular groups who've got particular interests which aren't necessarily going to be broadly shared. How do we manage that? And we've started to do that by enabling something called an incubator. So this is effectively an ungoverned space. It becomes like a sandpit, if you like, for archetypes. And it's not, it may be public, it may be private. People can choose how they want to set it up, but it's not part of the formal governed space, but allows people to start to sort of participate and to build early models and start to collaborate with people as well. So that's kind of an interesting thing as we start to see people using those kinds of things as well. Next, please. These are some of the other tensions, the notion of top-down versus bottom-up. So I remember some very early discussions where we had people saying that everybody should be able to build archetypes, and they can. But anyone who volunteers something, it should be able to go into the CKM, and then we should be able to gradually refine it and so on. And you know, that's a great philosophy, and I adhere to that to a large degree. But at the same time, if we're trying to build, especially in the international CKM, a cohesive pool of archetypes that can be broadly used by all, we actually have to be pretty careful about the kind of patterns and the level of the patterns, I guess, and those kinds of things that are around quality and so on. So we actually start to get pretty good standard of draft archetypes that we know are going to take us forward in the right way, rather than kind of random ones which have come from a different background and so on. So there's a real tension of how to build a good quality pool of archetypes very effectively and as quickly as possible, versus allowing a sort of random proliferation of archetypes from all sorts of sources without a lot of governance, if you like. So we're trying to fill a balance there where people offer archetypes, and to be honest, it's not happening very often at the moment. We are trying to work with people to get them into a position where they will kind of fit within that cohesive pool as a draft, and then we just refine them. So we're trying to kind of get the balance between the two, allow people to participate, to volunteer things, to offer things, but also keep some sense of governance over the top of it. And that's an interesting tension to have. The other thing around collaboration, and it's something that you guys might find obvious, but what we are consistently noticing is that in other paradigms of development of these models, where you have to pull especially clinicians out of their daily practice and bring them together in a central place. You might have to fly them in or whatever it is to transport people to a central place. You'll take them out of their practice for 1 or 2 or 3 days and lock them in a room until you get to some kind of consensus. The opportunity cost for the clinicians, the number of patients they're not seeing, all the fallout from that, where they have to go back and pick up the pieces and so on, that's huge. Whereas what we now have is a potential model for collaboration where people can do it at home, they can do it in downtime, in their office time, they can do it at a time that's convenient, it's online, it's asynchronous, and potentially with a glass of wine after dinner and the kids are in bed, and it becomes quite a pleasant thing. It's kind of changing that paradigm of collaboration, and it's also broadening the ability for anyone to participate, rather than having only credentialed people kind of brought into meetings who are the official authorities, yet may not actually be the domain experts that you need. So this has been something that's been quite exciting too. We're actually opening up the opportunity for the right kind of people to be participating in the right kind of archetype reviews. Next, please, Lewis. We'll start with just complex. The archetype creation and design has been a long, long haul to get us to where we are. Next, please. So I'll just emphasise it's been quite a tricky process. But there's a few things. I've found the entry classes brilliant, really. I know that there are some groups who've looked at the open air approach, and they've really recoiled at the notion of being locked into observations, evaluations, instructions and actions. SIMI particularly, they found that very, very difficult, and I couldn't persuade them that this was actually something of enormous value, because every day when I build an archetype, I'm actually very grateful for the attributes that each of those classes brings from the reference model. Now, it doesn't mean it's perfect, but we find there are grey zones between observations and evaluations quite often. Ian and I have quite long arguments sometimes around whether it's an observation or an evaluation, and the truth is it's probably somewhere in the middle, and it probably doesn't matter if it's one or the other. But the things that the observations in particular bring, as far as being able to do intervals of time and averages and all those kinds of things, I use that all the time with a lot of modelling, especially around bringing in device-based data and those kinds of things. And the actions took me a long, long time to get used to how to model. I still don't think I'm perfect at it, but the more I understand them and the more I see them used in implementations, it's an incredibly elegant way to be able to track the status of these instructions and orders that we've given. So I find those particularly are very, very useful. Next, please. Now, this old dilemma, who do you actually get to model, or who should be doing it? We had that very early experience where in the NHS we had purely technical modelers with no access to clinicians building models, and that was pretty obvious that wasn't really achieving the goal that we had. Now, what we've done often in training is that we will get a mixed group of technical people and clinical people, and we will give them a task to do their first archetype to build. And we usually try and get them to mix up and say, well, let's have half and half, or a mixture, so that you've got a cross-section of people with contributions. We'll give them a mind map or some kind of requirements in common, but inevitably what happens is the technical people work together and the clinical people work together. So it's not just my observation, but I've had other people who've then gone around and looked at the way people are then creating an archetype based on the same content they're looking at it on the screen, and they'll say the technical people and the clinical people are approaching it totally differently, and it's true. So it's not to be underestimated. You really need either a very close clinical or other, if it's not clinical, but the domain expert input to whoever is modelling, or a clinical informatician who is actually kind of bridging both to be actually doing the modelling, to make sure that you are actually representing the clinical concepts as is sensible to clinicians. Within the NETA group as well, they had largely technical models doing their work, and I would be having constant sort of arguments with them, because they would be building observations, and then they would specialise the observation for blood pressure, and then they would specialise that in a similar way for weight, and so on, when in fact we've got quite clear clinical models that are quite different in representation, yet they tried to squeeze that into that other pattern that made sense to them from a technical point of view. So I can't overemphasize that, I guess, that the clinicians need to be a major part of this kind of design. Next, please. Ian has this wonderful image of two guys fighting as we try to work out what goes into a data set or what goes into a template. This is my version of it, an Australian representation of a similar thing. We find that the notion of maximal data set stops a lot of the arguments. Everyone who's trying to build minimum data sets, you all know how difficult that is, trying to agree on what everyone finds acceptable. The arguments around maximal data sets is usually about what is actually correct or what is not, and that's a lot easier to sort out. Occasionally we can't agree on something and we're not sure whether it actually is appropriate or not, and so we might take it out in the meantime. But the notion of maximal data set being inclusive is really freeing up, if you like, and we find that works very well, as does this notion of universal use case. So being able to be applicable across all the kinds of clinical contexts we think that archetype might be useful for. But we used to say, we're aiming for the maximal data set, we're aiming for the universal use case, but we've got wiser, and we now understand sometimes we just need to be very pragmatic, and so not all archetypes are maximal or universal. they are actually probably covering, some of them, like for example adverse reaction, would be huge if we tried to cover all the use cases that might be recorded for reporting and so on for the very, very few situations where you need it. So we've toned it back to be one that's covering what we think are the common requirements and allowing it to be extended in particular areas around the actual reaction and around the exposure to the substance and so on, where that's applicable, and for the smaller use cases where that's needed. So it's kind of got very sensible and pragmatic, and that's kind of nice balance. There's no exact rules around that. It's really a matter of sort of clinical sensibility, and at the moment that seems to work reasonably well. We don't often have arguments about that, but maybe that will come more in the future. Yet to see. Next, please. Now, patterns. Patterns has been the bane of my life for so long. I've had people saying, what are the patterns? What patterns have you got? In fact, Thomas sort of draws things out sometimes. And I go, where did he get that from? Because he's able to sort of see things sometimes from a technical abstract point of view. But to me, the clinical patterns have taken a long time to start to evolve. And that long time has not been just because it's been duration. There's been a lot of attempts and iterations for some of the really hard things through that time. So some are really easy. What you see is what you get. A number of the observations, especially around scores, like APGAR and glucose coma scale and things like that, they're very well documented. We know exactly what the clinical content needs to be. All of the definitions of the data elements are there. The kind of use cases and stuff are all pretty clear too. So the modelling is really quite straightforward. Similarly, with a number of the clusters and the evaluations, in general, they're often quite straightforward. It's just designing by working out what the requirements are. The actual creation of the archetypes are relatively simple. When you start to get into some of the more complex things, especially the actions, especially ones where we've identified common frameworks eventually, so things like the laboratory reports, imaging reports, the procedure actions. So, procedures need to cover everything from putting in an IV or putting in a catheter right through to potentially a full operation. We've actually got a framework for that and a framework for labs where there is commonality for the most simple through to the most complex. And then we've been able to build, or starting to build, clusters that enable the detail to be expressed completely. And that enables sensible querying, because it means you can always go and immediately find a procedure, and then you can work down and work out which is the specific procedure. You can find the labs and pull those out in queries and so on, much easier than if there were multiple specializations and so on. That's a pattern that's evolving. It's something that we're still working on to refine, but it's been really a realization in, say, the last 12 months, and that's been coming along, so it's taken a long time. Physical examination has been particularly complex, and I have got hundreds of megabytes of space on my computer taken up with mind maps where I've tried to find patterns for archetypes and so on that would make sense. We started off with the notion that the clinicians work from, inspection, palpation, auscultation, that kind of thing. And we tried to then build archetypes that would suit those and specialise them, and try to work out the common patterns that would then work for every single specialisation. So if we're inspecting skin, then you could specialise it to inspect a wound, and you could inspect a mole, and you could, all of these kinds of things. And no matter what I tried to do to try and shoehorn the clinical content into what I thought were sensible patterns, it never quite worked. So what we've actually now starting to do more is we've got a single archetype mostly that we're using, which is an observation, and it's called physical examination. It's observation.exam in CKM. And it is a really simple archetype that really just has it has a text field, which means that if we've just got a legacy content, we can just have free text that gets put into that area, or we can then have a simple description of the examination, and then we've got a slot that allows any level of clusters to go in there. And those clusters are the magic which enables us to nest little bits of clinical content, clinical examination content in whatever order makes sense for the clinician. So it depends on the emphasis of what they're looking at, and it enables us to do very complex representations of the clinical examination that we couldn't do beforehand. So that's actually been quite a major breakthrough. We still haven't got lots of archetypes around examination, but what we've tested so far seems to be working quite well. And the pattern that I have sort of been changing is I started off learning and trying to work with specialisations. There were technical issues which have now been resolved within the 1.5 specification that's coming through, but in actual fact I still don't think I'll be using specialisations very much, because it's often just more sensible to be pragmatic and to use these patterns that have evolved. We'll use specialisation mainly around localisation and local requirements where we need to add them to the common interoperable archetypes. Next please, Lewis. Templates. Now Ian has this statement where archetypes get all the glory but templates do all the work, and it's really true. The two-level modelling and the freedom that comes from using templates is really spectacular, and you can show people and you can train people about archetypes and they kind of get it, but they're always looking a bit puzzled. But when you actually start to build a template and you show them a number of archetypes coming together and it's starting to make sense and look like something that is clinically relevant to them, you see everyone has their aha moment and the smiles come and people start to get it. So not only is it useful from the technical point of view, but as far as sort of getting clinicians engaged and stuff, the templates are a little bit of magic. Next, please. The other thing with the templates is that not everybody needs huge amounts of training. So it's something that can be used locally, it can be decentralised. If we have common patterns, for example, a discharge summary that might be on a national CKM, they can be tweaked at a local hospital level or even on a ward level or even on a per clinician level, just by simple training here and then deployed as it needs to be. Next, please. Again, those fighting kangaroos, but this is where we get clinician diversity. And I've had an obstetrician say to me, there's no way we would ever be able to sort of share a health record with midwives, very disdainfully, very arrogantly. But in fact, when you look at the kind of clinical content we're needing for a specialist obstetrician versus a midwife, the actual content is almost identical, but they use slightly different terms and they might have slightly different emphasis in what data they're filling out. The archetypes essentially are going to be largely the same, but templates will now enable us to express the common archetypes in a way that suits the obstetrician and a way that suits the midwife. And to me, it's a pretty spectacular way to be able to operate and still know that we've got those archetypes as a source of truth underneath. So it's really important from that point of view. Next. The power of reuse is something, again, that I'm getting more and more experience with and more examples of how it is actually being a very effective way to operate. So every new project that we do, we're always able to take a whole lot that have been developed previously and we're gradually able to grow them. And so this was a particular project in the Northern Territory that I did, and this was some of the analysis that I did afterwards. So we were reusing nearly 60% of the archetypes, and for a whole new domain we're able to build 40% more, and those ones would then be reused in the next project and so on. So it's kind of like this big snowball that's gathering momentum each time, and I think over time the reuse is going to go up even when we're doing new domains. So I find that quite exciting too. It's also quick. You can show things, even when you're doing a new analysis with people working it out, you can actually build most of the templates they require in front of them in real time, and I've been doing that when I'm working with clinicians, and so that's something that sort of engages them, but it's also just a very efficient way to do things. Next, please. And of course, from the technical point of view, it's not just how we engage the template building and the clinicians in building it, but it's also about all the sorts of things that can come out of the templates. So I'm sure that there have been people who've been talking about that quite consistently through the conference so far, so I won't go down that, but they're very flexible, and the document generation and so on that we can start to do from CKM is also template driven, and that's really important. A whole tool chain from archetypes using templates to create all sorts of downstream artifacts. Next, please, Lewis. And then the governance, the nightmare of governance, it makes my head hurt so many days. And it's also part of what makes me get up in the morning as well. We've learned a lot along the way of building CKM, starting from that very first sort of chaotic beginnings through to now. But every time we nut something out, we find out something more that's even more complex down the track. So, be under no illusions, this is a very complex domain, and the tool that with CKM and so on is certainly supporting a lot of that. We haven't nutted all of it out by any means, but we're certainly making some good inroads into it that will help support the implementation and help support the collaboration and all that brings. So what we need to do is we talk about govern the archetypes like hell, basically. Govern them very, very tightly. The templates don't need to be governed at all, although we can, upload them into a CKM so that they can be shared and they can be potentially reused and tweaked and so on. If they're going to be used for reporting purposes, then they do need to be governed so that we can make sure that those are meeting, government requirements for reporting, etc. But as a rule, they're not usually needing to be governed in quite the same way. Next, please. I'm not sure if Ian and Thomas have been speaking to you about archetype identification issues. We've been revising this recently, and it's been driven largely from CKM requirements that we've been nagging Thomas to relook at some of this. The notion of how to determine what's a wild versus a governed archetype if you find it in a system or if someone shares it with you, and how we go through and manage the archetype versions and revisions and builds, etc., from a technical point of view, versus also how we manage the clinical knowledge governance from the point of view of publication status. Is it a draft? Is it currently in a review process? Is it published, etc., and how we bring all of that together. So I'm not going to go anywhere down that track, but there is some considerable work happening at the moment that we need to talk. Thomas and Ian can talk to you, I think, ad infinitum about them. Next, please. Just recently, we've brought into the CKM space the notion of, folders, really at the simplest level. And within the governed CKM space, we have these notions of subdomains and projects to enable collaboration to happen at various levels of granularity. And also the incubators that I mentioned before, which are in an ungoverned space, so they're not actually following the rules and they're not published in quite the same way, but it allows that sort of sandpit notion for people to be able to start to play and collaborate within the CKM environment with others who are participating, but it's not needing to follow the rules of governance. Next, please. The other thing we've been grappling with, and this is an ongoing thing, is about how we manage groups of artefacts. So building the templates and making sure the templates work and we know which version and which revision of each archetype is in each template, etc., gets very complex and convoluted at times. Similarly, managing release sets. So you might build a release set that has all the archetypes, all the templates, all the reference terminology reference sets that comprise a particular specification, and we can combine those together and send them out. Again, managing exactly which version and revision of those is part of that kind of process. And then we're able to start to bring together some of these referenced archetypes, these virtual ones, if you like, from another instance as a read-only within the CKM to enable some of the issues to be managed too. Next, please. The notion of how to federate I've touched on before, so I think I'll leave that in the interest of time. Next, please, Lewis. Now, the person power, how do we kind of manage the CKM and that governance side of things from a person point of view? And I'll be talking more from a single standalone instance. So this is the kind of thing we've been talking to Silje and her team, and this is what we've been talking to Slovenia. It's what we're doing within the open air space, that we need a number of people, a small number of people who have oversight of all of the different artefacts and all of the governance. So they are highly skilled and they need to be trained up and mentored and stuff to get to the point where they can manage this sustainably, so that they make sure that that pool that's within that CKM are coherent, that they work together, that they are minimal overlap. We want to avoid that where possible, but also minimising the gaps between the clinical knowledge concepts as well. So there's a bit of an art and a skill in that, certainly. we're suggesting there would be a core team of, I call them archetype wranglers. So these are, again, highly skilled people who are really, their purpose is to be building the archetypes, to be utilising common patterns, common levels of granularity, that kind of thing. And it needs to be drawing together informaticians, domain experts, and so on. Oops, you've skipped. Yep, thank you. Back again. The editorial team could be the same group, or they could be others that are brought in just to manage the editorial reviews, which are either content, terminology, or translation. Most of the work that we've done to date has been content-based, just getting the archetypes to the point where we can publish them, but we have the capacity to do the same thing for terminology bindings and for translations. As I've said, the template authors don't need to have quite the same level of training to get them to the point of building the content side of things, but when they need to go to an implementation, they certainly need to have some finessing that's done in terms of that does take further skills. And then we've got the broad online community of reviewers, and we want everybody. So I've got friends who have barely been able to utilise Word, barely able to use a computer, but they know their clinical domain, and I've actually been able to get them onto CKM, and they've given feedback to some of the archetypes where they're experts. And it's been around very simple things, but they've changed the flavour of the archetype quite appropriately. So, we're trying to reduce the barriers to entry and enable any clinical expert, any domain expert to be able to participate, no matter, they don't have to understand OpenAIRE, they don't have to understand archetypes, just participate at what level that they can. Next, please. I think we're getting close to the end here. We are. So into the future, I'm looking forward to having the potential to have some focused and coordinated and resourced activities to build these archetypes and templates to get the CKMs working to their full potential. SDO collaboration is interesting. There's been certainly some cross-pollination with CIMI. There was even a conversation this afternoon where we're starting to work out if we could get some collaboration with FHIR, that some of the clinical expertise from the archetypes might be utilised in developing some of the FHIR artefacts. We are having some discussions with CDISC around some of the tooling, whether they would actually engage more fully in something that's closer to OpenAIRE, maybe not, but it'll be interesting to see. And obviously over the years we've also had some close engagement with IHT-SDO, and I don't know quite where that would go. Currently there is some increasing interest from areas where they're looking at archetypes for secondary use, and particularly there's an EU project around registries that's just kicking off. So it'll be interesting to see. It's not just direct patient care and EHR, etc., but looking at some of these other kinds of aspects of clinical data being utilised and being able to draw that kind of research or registry data from an EHR without being able to, avoiding the duplication, etc. Next. So quite hopeful about some of those things around FHIR, CDISC and IHT-SDO. I'm not so sure, but I'm feeling quite encouraged by those other ones. Next, please, Lewis. Between the different CKMs, the collaborating community, I think, has enormous potential to grow. The people that are coming on board that are running the new CKMs, I think, have the same mindsets, and it'll be fascinating to see how we can start to grow that. Modelling documentation of patterns and so on is something that's been missing, and I think we're getting to the point where we can start to document those sensibly, although I'm dreading that because it's still something that evolves. Each archetype that we build does still we learn something more and we build on it. And the notion of training is something that's challenging, and I know the Foundation has been looking at how they might start to standardise that, and in fact I've got meetings tomorrow where we've got Evelyn Havenga, who's an expert in health education, is put together a framework of how we might start to do some online training and accreditation for these kinds of courses, and we're starting to look at how we might start to build some content that will start with Ocean, just because we were looking at exploring it at the same time, but potentially be something that will apply across all sorts of opportunities in a standardised way. So we'll be the test bed, if you like. So I'm quite hopeful about that too. So that's the end. Can you just do next for me, Lewis? So I don't think we need to have the life buoys. I don't think we need to throw that out. Maybe a couple of years ago I was feeling a bit like that and feeling a bit despondent. Next, please. And I'm not quite sure why I've chosen this one. When I was in Norway, I did a wonderful trip, and here's some reflections, and there's kind of a way forward, I guess, in this photo. But I had a lovely time visiting your country. It's a little selfie of me up in the corner, so if you don't know what I look like, now you do know. That was the other person on the end of the camera at the time that was being taken. It was rather cold in January. Look, I hope that's been useful. I haven't left as much time as I'd hoped for questions. But that's, I guess, a reflection of where I am, where I think modelling is at the moment. So happy to take questions in what time we've got left.